Hi, I'm David Beckworth, and as you probably know, the Federal Reserve will begin its framework review at its 2025 FOMC meeting. And just in case you've not got your fill of framework review discussions from conferences, from podcasts, from social media, and other conversations, I'm here to give you one more round of exciting and fun conversations on the topic. Now, we learned in November from Chair Powell that potentially big changes are afoot. He sat down with a reporter from the Washington Post and told her that his base case approach to this framework review is to have a reaction function or a framework that does not promise to overshoot. In other words, does not make up for past misses in the target. That's what FATE is. That is what the framework does that's currently in place that was adopted in 2020. So there could be big changes afoot. We might go from FATE back to FIT. We'll talk about that later. And I want to discuss this using the presentation that I gave at a conference recently. And this conference was hosted by the American Institute for Economic Research. My presentation was titled Stress Testing the Framework, and I was on a panel looking at lessons learned. And so I want to do that with you, and I'm going to do that in three parts. The first one is going to be looking at inflation lessons learned over the past few years. Secondly, framework lessons learned. And then third, putting those all together into monetary policy implications. Now, these three parts will be broken up into three different segments. Each will be in a different video. This video you're watching now consists just of this first part, inflation lessons learned. So let's go and look at inflation lessons learned. And the first one should be obvious, something we learned in the 1970s, but we forgot. And that is the public really dislikes inflation. It became very poignant, salient during the election of President Donald Trump. According to many polls, it was a very important issue. Let's look at one poll, for example, from Gallup that looked at the most important financial problem. This poll tracks a similar set of questions from about 2005. And as you can see, you have questions about your income affecting your financial health. You have questions about gas and energy prices, questions about debt, questions about housing, questions about the cost of healthcare. Finally, there was a question about the cost of living or inflation. As you can see, this one shot up in 2021 and has yet to come down. The last time this survey was taken was in May of 2024. And as of that date, this was the number one problem, which is interesting that it continues to be a problem despite inflation coming down. Now, Gallup also asked another question, it's a little more general. What is the most important problem overall? And this goes back to 1960. Now, I've shown you in this chart the response of unemployment. And you can see the unemployment response tracks nicely where there are recessions. Unemployment tends to respond with a lag. So the spikes are where there are recessions and shortly thereafter. Now, I provide this to provide context for the next series I'm going to show you, and that is the cost of living and inflation series. And you can see here several things. One, the absolute level of inflation concern was incredibly high in the 1970s, hit 70%. It was the most important concern, even higher than the spikes of unemployment concerns. And then you go to the present, it again is elevated. It's higher than unemployment, although it's not as large in absolute size as it was in the 1970s. Nonetheless, in 2022, this measure of inflation was a top concern according to this poll. Now it's come down, it's gone back up, and it is worth noting that it persists. I want you to hang on to that observation. Despite inflation coming down in both these polls, inflation continues to be an important issue. I think that's an important insight we'll explain later. So let's talk about why the public so dislikes inflation. There's been a number of studies that have been done in response to the inflation surge. And one of the better known ones took place this year. It was reported this year. Stephanie Strancheva at Brookings had a paper showing, based on a survey, why people dislike inflation. And the main takeaway is because they feel that it lowers their purchasing power. Their real income goes down because of inflation. Now, many people will say, well, they are just misled if they actually look at the data relative to what's happening. They're actually doing fine. Zachary Maslish had a recent note that shows actually when you look at data carefully, you go from hourly to weekly and annual data, the real earnings are actually down. So they really are putting their finger on something. Another important study that was done over this period comes from Joe Hazel and his colleagues, and he found that inflation creates conflict costs. You got to negotiate to get the higher wage to keep up with inflation, and that's uncomfortable and painful for many people. There are other stories that have been told. Inflation affects everyone. Unemployment only affects some. There's several cognitive biases you could point to as well. Number one, people have a loss aversion. They feel more negatively about losses than they do positively about gains. So they may feel more negatively about losses in real income from high inflation than the gains they get from a full employment economy. A similar but slightly different cognitive bias is that people worry more about things they have less control over. So people tend to worry about flying more than driving because they feel they have more control over driving, even though driving is probably more dangerous. So in the context of a full employment economy, say 2022, the public felt as though it could get a job, on demand. They just have to go out and look for one. So they have control over employment, but they had no control over the fact prices were rising so much. They tend to worry about the things they feel like they have less control over. For those and other reasons, the public really dislikes inflation. Again, many of these lessons were learned in the 1970s, and we relearned them in this period. All right, second insight from this period with regards to inflation lessons learned is that there are inflation threshold effects. And what that simply means is that people begin to take note of inflation once it hits a certain level. There's been several interesting studies that have been done on this. The first one was done by Oliver Fati at the University of Austin, and he found there's a 4% threshold effect. At 4%, the public begins to take notice of what's happening. He notes that attention doubles when inflation exceeds this 4% threshold, and that adverse supply shocks become more inflationary when you cross this threshold. So there's a common saying that central bankers should see through adverse supply shocks. Well, his point is it actually gets quite hard if you get past that 4% because people begin to notice more. In other words, it has a chance of unmooring inflation expectations, even though it's a supply shock. Another study that looked at this similar issue is a study by Ola Kornock, David Monroe, and Jia Shin, and they looked at Google searches for inflation. And I'm going to reproduce a chart they created for their study. They looked at many countries. I'm just going to reproduce it for the US. And what this chart shows is the CPI inflation rate plotted against Google searches for inflation. So you can see around 4% or below, there's not really a systematic relationship between the inflation rate and the Google search rate for inflation. Once you hit 4%, it takes off. Very strong positive relationship. Now, this data goes to 2023. I'll show you the updated data to this. But the point is there's the threshold effect. Now, these folks actually found that around 3.5%. I'm showing it from about 4%. So anywhere from 3 to 4%, there's this threshold effect. They become more mindful of inflation. Finally, there's an inflation scarring effect. Now, this point is that even though inflation has come down, the public is still very sensitive, more sensitive to inflation than they were prior to the inflation surge. Just a little bit of evidence to highlight this. Number one, if you look at the public's inflation expectations and look at the uncertainty around it, it is expanded relative to where it was before the inflation surge. So before the inflation surge here, as I noted, for 1 year ahead inflation expectations for the New York Fed's survey of consumer expectations, it went from 3.88 to 5.13 over the past year. So there's greater uncertainty, even though the median has come down. Likewise for the 3 year ahead, the 25 to 75 percentile has gotten larger. And so there's more sensitivity to it. I would also point you back to the Gallup polls that we showed earlier that indicated that inflation remains a top concern, even though inflation's come down. Also, the Google search for inflation that I showed earlier, this chart here shows the time series of that, and you can see it spikes, it comes down, but it's still elevated. It's nowhere near where it was before. If I plot these most recent points out, it's the blue one here, you can see there's a new structural relationship that has emerged, similar to what it was below 4% before, but now at a higher Google search rate. So people are more sensitive, they're searching more often. Now, this inflation scarring is not happening just in the US, but around the world. There's an EPSIS poll that tracks a number of concerns globally. It looks at 29 countries. And this first one here is the unemployment rate. It looks at corruption. It looks at COVID, as you can see, was the number one concern. It's come down significantly. And then it looks at inflation. Again, what you see here with inflation is that it goes up, it comes down, but it's still elevated relative to where it is before. So what's the big takeaway from these? Number one, the public's dislike of inflation means that the Fed needs to take the dual mandate seriously. Gadi Ergison, Don Cohn, in their paper they presented at Brookings on the framework, they noted that the new framework that was created in 2020, FATE, effectively put more weight on the maximum employment side of the dual mandate. And this suggests that the Fed should have equal weights on both sides. Just to illustrate this from the perspective of an earlier Gallup poll we saw, this here shows the inflation concern minus the unemployment concern. And you can see that inflation concern is greater than the unemployment up until the early 80s, and from the early 80s up until really 2020s, there's more concern about unemployment. So if you thought of the public's balance of risk from their perspective, for them, it was a weak labor market. But starting in 2020, now it's flipped, and they're concerned about inflation in the balance of risk. So for them, if anything, they would want more weight on the price stability part of the dual mandate. But this suggests the Fed should put at least equal weights on both sides of the dual mandate. Um, Another important takeaway is the Fed should not consider raising the inflation target rate. Now, they've said as much already. Chair Powell has said this, but the threshold effect says that if you were to do that, it would really create more sensitivity and might unanchor inflation expectations if you made such a move. So that should just reinforce the conclusion I think they've already drawn. Finally, the inflation scarring effect says that the Fed really should have a credible nominal anchor. And to do that really would help restore the certainty. It would reduce those uncertainty bands around their point estimates for the public. And so those are three takeaways I wanted to share with you in this first video of inflation lessons learned. Now, as we move forward, we're going to take a look next at the framework lessons learned, and after that, monetary policy implications. I'll see you in the next video.